Howdy folks, David Parsons here. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. I hope everything's going good for you. I wanted to just pop in here at the opening of today's show just to remind you to go check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. We have a whole lot of new stuff on there, but also it's just easier to get around the site now. We've divided all of our episodes and bonus material into collections, so you can look at just the movie episodes or just the episodes about the Vietnam War or just the episodes about Bernie Sanders or whatever we've been ranting about for years on this show. You can go check out, and it's a lot easier to navigate. And also, you don't have to pay for it for the first 7 days. You can do a free trial. These are all things that Patreon has done recently. They've made the whole app and site a lot easier to use for people that are part of the Nostalgia Trap universe. So I'm excited about that. I think the Patreon is the place to hang out, and it's the place where we put all of our stuff, not just the free stuff. So if you want to check it out, I really appreciate all the support that Nostalgia Trap listeners have given us over the years. It would be a lovely holiday gift for you to go and join and subscribe. But even if you don't pay us for it, I just like more ears and viewers on this stuff. So go check it out, do the free trial, and we appreciate it. All right, got a great episode and conversation to share with you today. My guest is Clay Routledge. He is the author of a book that I think will resonate powerfully with anyone who thinks about nostalgia as much as we do on this show. And if you're listening to the show, then maybe you think about nostalgia too, as a sort of phenomenon and object and piece of how we navigate our world. But this book by Clay Routledge is called How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. The book is called Past Forward. That's the subtitle, actually. So Past Forward is a book that sort of, I think in some ways, supplements and even counters a thesis that we've been developing over the years about the trap of nostalgia. Clay has a set of takes here about nostalgia, about memory, about how we recover our own personal histories and build identity, etc., that I think is really, really compelling and useful. And I thought, for me, made me think of nostalgia in a different way than perhaps I've thought of it before. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. As I've said, there's tons more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there. We appreciate all your support. Without further ado, here is my conversation with Clay Routledge. Clay Routledge, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it. And welcome to Nostalgia Trap.
Thanks for having me on, David. It's great to be here.
Well, it makes sense for me to be talking with you, I think, based on the fact that we've talked about nostalgia a lot on this show over the years. And you have a book out that I want to say the name of before we get started. It's called Past Forward, How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. And I love the title because the idea of the sort of juxtaposition between the memory of the past and the sort of direction of the future seems to be something you're hitting on in this book. I wonder, just to get us started, for people that don't know you, and what I've read about you, you've spent a number of years as an academic in the field of psychology, teaching and researching, and I wonder how nostalgia came to be a concern of yours. At what point are you sort of thinking, yeah, I'm going to write a book about nostalgia? Because it seems like it's such a ripe topic. I mean, we've got into it from a million different angles over the years, and I'd love to sort of hear your takes, because I think you've got a compelling set of perspectives on something that people, I think, engage in a lot without necessarily thinking about a lot.
Yeah. So the way I got interested in nostalgia is decades ago in graduate school. Even as an undergrad, I should say. When I was majoring in psychology as an undergrad, I was just really fascinated with time, and how humans experience time. And, really from a nerdy, cognitive, mechanical point of view. And, so even before I was interested in nostalgia, I was always reading psychology about how there's this weird thing, and you had this experience we've all had where it's sometimes feel like they're going really slow. Sometimes they feel like they're going really fast. And we look back and we're always where did the time go?
Yes.
And, so we have this subjective experience of time, which doesn't always perfectly map onto time as objectively measured, right? And our emotions influence, the type of information we're taking in influences it. Culture probably influences, there's cultures that are faster moving, slower moving, and so forth. So I was just always kind of into that. But then when I started graduate school, I became very interested in a field of psychology called existential psychology, and in the writings of cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker in his
Mhm.
book the Denial of Death in particular. And really what that work is about is about our ability to think about the future, and specifically the future that's not great, which is our inevitable mortality. And so what Becker wrote about is how humans invest in all these cultural systems, belief systems, the most obvious being religion, of course, but all sorts of different philosophies and life beliefs and ideologies and personal beliefs that help us grapple with the inevitability of our mortality. Right? It doesn't sit well. Like other organisms, like we're in the service of survival and we want to reproduce. At the genetic level, at least, genetic replication. Like that's kind of the story of evolution. But we happen to be the organism smart enough to be aware of the fact that goal, eventually will fail, right? Eventually will die. And so we do lots of things to feel more transcendent, was basically Becker's writing.
Mhm.
And I was really just, into that idea of how humans turn to beliefs that provide meaning in our lives as a way to help us cope with existential anxiety about our mortality. That all sounds kind of like dark. That's like sort of what we used to call like the dark side of existential psychology. Then of course the light side is the more like positive psychology, like folks, right? But then I started thinking about how, well, the same like superpower, so to speak, or the same like mental ability to think about the future, which causes anxiety, also allows us to travel backwards in time. And then it's like, well, maybe we use that ability to travel backwards as a way to help us deal with our traveling forward and getting anxiety from it. So the very first study I wanted to do back in graduate school on this topic with my PhD advisor was looking at, the simple question of, when people are anxious about their future mortality, do they become more nostalgic, and does that like reduce their anxiety? And we found support for that idea. So my very, very first interest in nostalgia was actually thinking about it more as a response to like worrying about the future, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll get into it, but like my view has evolved. One of the coolest thing I think about being a researcher, a scientist, is the sort of following the data. Like you have certain ideas, and then like, you do studies, you make observations, and your mind changes. You're like, oh, I didn't think that, and that sort of process of discovery has made my views of nostalgia change quite a bit. It still very much has that component of defensiveness. I think that's still very much part of it, but I think it's a lot more than that, as I'm sure we'll get into.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's to me, it's that nostalgia functions in so many ways, but one of them is that amelioration, that comfort, that feeling, almost like a drug. That you can sort of
Mm-hmm.
retreat to this sort of gauzy, beautiful vision of the past and feel good. And it seems like people engage in that a lot. I don't know. I wonder if part of it, because I think about nostalgia in terms increasing as a life as people get older. In other words,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like so much nostalgia, and maybe this is a cultural thing, but so much nostalgia is built into like nostalgia for youth, for your
Yeah.
particular
Yeah.
sort of experiences of the halcyon days of your youth. I know not
Right.
everybody has great memories of their youth, obviously, but either
Right.
way, I mean, it seems like there's a need to go back to that specific time. I think about like the image of like Al Bundy on sitting on the couch on Married with Children, sort of like reminiscing about his days being a football star. And that was a way in high school. And that was like the only thing that ever happened to him that was good. And it seems like a
Yeah.
lot of people sort of fall into that form of nostalgia. I think that's part of what I mean when I think about the nostalgia trap, is the idea of sort of like, using nostalgia as a sort of drug and a way of not dealing with
Yeah.
either the present or the future, or even feeling like your life is meaningless.
Did you did you ever see that movie Napoleon Dynamite?
Oh yeah.
With Uncle Rico, right? Like that's
Yeah.
basically his character, right? It's like
Right. There are a million examples. Yeah.
right. It's just such a funny. Um, yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting about nostalgia, like in the sort of complex nature of nostalgia, is that is definitely part of the story. And there's actually this concept called the reminiscence bump, and
Mm.
where we do just tend to, like, if you look over the life course, people just tend to have like a bias towards like the aesthetic, like whether it's, like music, fashion, movies, and the memories associated with that time of in the years of our adolescence, and teenage years, and maybe a little bit into young adulthood. So you're absolutely right. There's something about that time that that we really privilege in our nostalgic memories. And to be clear, like, you can have nostalgic memories from any part of your life, and as you get older, you tend to have more. Like, the more momentous life experiences you have, like, like an 80-year-old is going to have more from the memory bank to draw from, right? And so they're going to think about like, oh, the birth of their grandchildren. They're not just going to think about like their high school years. But you're absolutely right. There's something special about that time that clearly influences culture. Like, I was talking to someone recently about nostalgic like movies, and we were talking about this notion that, like, it's like when producers and writers and directors, like, it's kind of at the it's not a surprise that we make that now. A lot of what's popular is like the Stranger Things and the kind of 1980s and even 90s stuff. Like, the people my age, I'm 47, are now like in charge or like high enough, I guess, in like the corporate ladder of like the people greenlighting like where they spend, where the where they're what scripts they're buying, what they're spending money on. And that you see that, like, you just see that pattern. Like, there's like a 20 to 30 year kind of like, oh, we get to talk to you about our childhood now, and you get
Yes.
to watch like and there's a cool thing about it too. It's not just like we're just repeating things. Like, oftentimes I'm not a big fan of the new Star Wars movies. I grew up with the original, but one of the things we do in nostalgia is we also like, we're like, here's what I cared about when I was a kid, but also there's sort of this, but now it's your turn to make it more relevant and the more to the
It's like,
times.
dude, it's like passing religion down. I mean,
It
people
is.
people
It
make that,
is.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
analogy a lot, I guess, but that connection between pop culture and religion. But it seems like, especially in a society like American society in the 21st century, in which you see like declining church attendance and things like that, like pop culture seems to be the dominant way that people construct
Yeah.
meaning in their lives. So it makes
Yeah.
sense. I
And the
mean,
story, like these narratives, like these stories, and like redemptive stories, heroism stories, like life lessons. But you're right. Like, I wasn't trying to dodge a question. You're totally right that there's something about that time period that we seem to like be, like, advertisers actually were the first to figure this out, like back in like the 80s. Not advertisers, but at like consumer psychologists. They weren't really discovering how. I didn't mean to do the thumbs
isn't
up
that amazing that that does
thing.
that now? For those that are not watching us on Zoom, there are emojis popping up as we're
Yeah,
talking for some reason,
I was.
based on our hand
It kind of
gestures.
looks like narcissistic, like I'm giving myself a thumbs up for talking.
No, I approve as well. I was digging what you're
um,
saying. Yeah.
but yeah, like, we have this. We definitely, I like new music. I mean, I like new stuff, but I definitely have like so my high school years were the 90s, like grunge alternative music. And so,
Same. Yes.
like, I'm still jamming out on, the sort of classic alternate, like Alice in Chains, like Nine Inch Nails, stuff like that. Fugazi. I'm probably a little bit young for my older cousins and friends and stuff like that who were kind of more in like the punk scene.
Yes.
I
Yep.
picked up like Minor Threat and Fugazi and stuff from them, but it was a little bit like I was a little bit young. But that's actually another interesting way that nostalgia works too. Is like, you can have nostalgia for times before your time,
Yes.
because, and it's usually, if you probe, like, people will be like, oh, why is that person into classic cars, or why are they into like 60s, why do they like the Beatles, or why do they like mid-century architecture or whatever. And you can just like things because you like them, but a lot of times if you dig a little bit deeper, you'll find like you were talking about the passing down of religion, you'll find a connection point. It's like, oh, I remember my parents, when they were at their happiest, they were listening to Beatles in the house. Or I used to, my dad worked on classic cars in the garage, or, there are these like connection points.
Yeah, it's even stories, like nostalgia for stories about the past. I mean, basically the same age as you are. I'm 45, but my dad tells stories about the 50s. I didn't live through the 50s, but I feel like I did, in part because of these stories passed down.
Yeah.
And yeah, it feels like that iconography of the 50s too 50s and 60s seems like it was everywhere when we were young. And
Yeah.
makes me think that yeah, it was uh part of a passing down of sort of totems.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. But more than, but you're making the point about like the soothing effect, and that's definitely true. But one of the things we started to discover was that it's not that was so my original hypothesis is that that's basically the function of nostalgia. It's part of sort of a natural, like an organic psychological defense system built into us, that when we're dealing with like things that make us unhappy or stressed or anxious or uncertain in the present or worries about the future, we turn to the past for comfort. And I think that's definitely true. And we have a fair amount of evidence for that. But in addition to that, what we started to discover was it's not just that. Like nostalgia, and that's why I called the book Fast Forward, is like we started to discover that and we didn't originally like start out looking at this idea. Like I never would have thought to do a study, does nostalgia make people optimistic, for instance, like because that
Mm-hmm.
just wasn't in my mind. I was just thinking, well, nostalgia makes people less anxious. Like it removes negative states, but I didn't think about it adding positive states. But then what we started to discover, and really we discovered this thanks to our research participants, because we were collecting nostalgic memories. And the way we would do this is I actually lived in the UK at the time, in Southampton, which is like a city just south of London on the southern coast of England. And we were collecting nostalgic narratives from older adults. So we were going like door to door in neighborhoods and asking, older residents if they'd be willing to like either themselves like write down, we gave them paper, like write down a nostalgic memory, or say it to us and we could transcribe it. So we are collecting these stories essentially, right? And one of the things that, and then we were kind of looking at them. So this was more of like a qualitative data that was kind of, to help supplement our more traditional like behavioral science approaches of using questionnaires and experimental procedures and things like that, random assignment, stuff like that. We were just collecting, stories from people, and we were surprised at how many of them had like words like hope, that like revisiting this memory makes me hopeful for the future of my family. Because what they were doing is they were sharing an experience that like, and some of these people were actually sharing experiences from their childhood when when 90% of Southampton was destroyed by Nazi German bombing. And so this was a traumatic time. This wasn't like a time of like great prosperity and happiness and safety. Right. This is a time of war and hardship. Most of their dads were on the continent like fighting the Germans, and so this was a very, very disruptive time. But yet many of these people had stories about, well, it reminded, like, this was a time in which what was really most important, like your family, your connections, your community, like those things, like your attention was really focused on that. Like, and so like hard times like remind you of what's important in life and what you should most cherish. And it's easy to get distracted and all that. So you'd have these very, very like tough life stories, and people would draw inspiration from them. And then what was interesting is, a lot of times they would say, and revisit, and this reminds me today of like, it makes me thankful for like, not everyone, well, a lot of people would reference like not everyone lived, for one. Like it makes me, thankful that I got to go on and live a life, and I tried to live the best life I could and be a good parent and be a good citizen and all that stuff. And so I just thought that got us thinking that, well, it's not just comforting people. It also has this kind of inspirational component of saying, like, yeah, life's full of all sorts of different types of experiences. Some bad, some good. It's not like it's not like just a simple story of happiness. But within that life, even within a difficult life, thankfully, most of us have things we can draw upon that we find that were made it worth living, and that kind of gives us a boost today.
That totally makes sense. And it feels like it's part of a process that's very recognizable to me in terms of the weirdness. It feels counterintuitive to say that people might be nostalgic or have warm feelings or have some sort of sentiment for bad times, for going through like awful times. But I have like Studs Terkel's books behind me somewhere. The guy that took a ton of interviews with people that went through the Great Depression and World War II. And the nostalgia that's in there isn't a nostalgia that's kind of like, oh, those were wonderful times and I wish we could go back.
Right.
It's a lot more along the lines of what you're saying. It's sort of like it's evidence of resilience.
Right.
It's sort of like, oh, we went through horrific times, and yet I kind of have a sentiment for it in part because it showed us who we were. It showed us something that we can use. It's there's almost like I don't know,
Yeah.
practical knowledge you can mine from nostalgia, if that makes sense. Seems like that's
No,
what
I think that's
that.
an actually excellent way of putting it, because it is like and we tend to be more nostalgic for something the further we're separated from it in time and space. So it's like the further back it is and the further we are from it, like geographically, we tend to have more nostalgia for. And a lot of that has to do with that is because those are the things that we don't have as part of our daily routines, by function of their distance, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so like day to day, you don't need reminders of like you don't need to feel nostalgic about brushing your teeth if that's just part of your like daily routine. Like you've sort of built that lifestyle choice into your patterns. But a lot of times it is helpful to, especially as we get older and we get like busy and have all sorts of responsibilities and duties and things. It's good to be like have this reminders like, oh yeah, like I used to be adventurous. And I used to, I had this experience before that I had to like put myself out there and do something different. And that can be, as you get set in these routines, that can be like a good, like practical life lesson. It's like, this might be a different situation right now, but I can do something new again. Like and so I think that's part of that, getting back to that question about the youth thing. There's something about our teenage years where we're not just a kid. We're like emerging from just being the kid that my like parents like drag around, to developing my own sense of self. What are my interests? Developing your own friendships, getting that kind of freedom to, to like go pick who you want to hang out with and when. Like, what am I going to do with my life? All that stuff. There's something about that time of like identity formation, of like self, like self discovery, I guess. That would seem there seems to be some lessons from as we get older. And the other aspect of it is the further time that's passed, the more we've had our brains had the ability, I don't even think this is conscious, to sort of make sense of it and weave it into like our life narrative. So like right when you're going through something, if it sucks, right? Like if you're probably not gonna be like, oh, I'm gonna be someday I'm gonna look back on this fondly. No, because right now it's like you're dealing with the unpleasantness of it and the negative emotions of it, and that's like we're taking up a lot of bandwidth. But as time passes, you've had more of an opportunity to be like, okay, like now I can draw some lessons from that experience, especially if there was, for lack of a better way of saying it, kind of like a triumphant or redemptive sort of like ending to it. Like, oh, like it was really difficult or this didn't, but in the end, it made me better in some way. I accomplished something in some way. A relationship got stronger, or I like overcame some obstacle or whatever. So like the life like experiences that we have like that are especially powerful because they're reminders to us of like, they take us out of the moment. Like in any moment, you can be like, yeah, right now it's tough. And we could talk about the pandemic because I think there were like tons of great examples of this and that during that time.
Pandemic nostalgia is already happening, right? Like I feel like
yeah, it
I
actually is.
I knew it in the moment. I was like, people are gonna be talking about the making of bread and when we were all home together, and
Right.
like it was such a weird moment, but it did feel like I don't know, since it felt temporary in some way,
Yeah.
it felt like, oh, we're gonna be thinking about this in weird ways in the
Yeah.
future.
You're right. And I remember thinking about that too. Is like, um, when, my wife and I like, it's, you was like, oh, we can't go out. And we used to just go to breweries or do whatever I wanted to do or whatever. And now we're like afraid of like, the things that are fun, like getting together with people and drinking beer and hanging out, are the things that could be
Right,
dangerous
right.
to our. And so I do remember like thinking, but at the same time, it's like, people are working from home, we're like cultivating hobbies, we're doing things like that. But I remember at the time simultaneously thinking like, oh, people are going to be nostalgic for this, but right now they're also like planning, they're nostalgic for when they had before the pandemic, and they're using that like as their, well, this won't last forever. And when we come out of this, I'm gonna really make sure to like not take for granted that you can go out to do things with people.
That's
So you
so
like saw
weird.
people
Yeah.
using nostalgia while they were kind of like, planning their next nostalgia.
Yeah, I have this memory actually of at some point because we hadn't gone to a restaurant or bar. My wife and I were talking about this. We said, one day we'll be sitting in a bar again, and we thinking, remember when we were all wearing masks and sitting at home? Remember that weird moment? And we were already like pre nostalgia.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fascinated the same way as you are about that time element because t- I mean, maybe it's a function of being in our 40s, but it's all
Mm,
like when the pandemic happened. But the last 5 years have just gone by in a really weird,
yeah.
weird way. And
Yeah.
to the point where I'm like, I find myself having memories that I think were months ago, but they were 4.5 years ago, and
Yeah.
vice
Yeah.
versa. And it seems like it's more, I don't know, it seems like it's more distorted than ever before. I don't know. It seems like we're in
Yeah.
a, I don't know, a timeless moment or something.
No, I totally agree. It's almost been like disorienting in a way. I was looking at like movies the other night to watch, and I've been watching this. I'm kind of a sucker for like monster stuff. Like I've been watching that Monarch
Hmm.
show about on Apple TV, and I was like going back, and I was like, oh yeah, there was this. They started remaking the American like Godzilla movies, and now there's this new Godzilla movie, this Japanese one,
Yes.
Godzilla minus one, which I really want to see. But I was like, oh yeah, I should rewatch the ones they started making, and I was looking for them, and I was like pretty shocked that um there was like I think there was like one Godzilla, was it like Godzilla King of Monsters or something that said like it came out in 2019, and then there was like Godzilla versus Kong, which like is even more recent, and I was like, where did the where
Yeah.
did the time go?
How
Like,
did all this yeah, it's weird because my associations are so my memories and my nostalgia about the 90s and even the early 2000s are much more like clear in terms of when things happened and oh, I remember when this movie came out. It seems I don't know, part of me thinks it's like that fracturing of culture in the sense that we don't all go to the movie theater and see the same thing at once, but everyone
oh
just kind of
yeah,
watches on
yeah.
their computer. I don't know. I wonder about that. It's something I was thinking about when I was looking at your book, Clay. Is thinking about like so how technology
Mm,
mitigates all this nostalgia in part because it
yeah.
seems like young here I am putting on my old guy cap and saying young people today grow up
Right.
on the internet and I think about my own sort of nostalgia about the internet. I don't know. And we are our lives, and I say people our age, sort of
Hmm.
straddle the internet being like the dominant sort of cultural feature. In other words, like the first half of our lives were not on the internet, and then the second half was. And so I have a nostalgia that's like an analog nostalgia in part, of like,
Mm,
oh, what was life like before we Googled things and before we texted each other all the time and that sort of slow life that was before. And the
yeah.
nostalgia is totally my nostalgia is very much tied up with that and
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
real and not and kind of freaking out about like, well, do I have memories about like when I saw a particular tweet or when I oh, remember when that tweet came out, that one tweet. I mean, I do remember when one like Trump tweet came out, I guess when he got COVID. But other than that, it's sort of like your memories on the internet are not, I don't know, they don't seem as powerful. I'm not sure
Yeah.
if you
It's
know what I'm
yeah.
saying, but yeah.
No, no, I do know what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, and so I don't have any research on this particular question. I know exactly what you're talking about, and I do. My intuition is there is something especially powerful about nostalgia that implicates more sensory inputs. So that sounds really technical, but I mean, like if you physically touch something. So, for instance, smell.
Oh
We
yeah, yeah, yeah.
know we know for a fact there is good brain research on like olfactory, like it's ancient, it's powerful. Like you can get that familiar smell. It's a very powerful. So taste is very powerful. So like like food related nostalgia. Of course, like music is like a sensory input. It can be digitalized, obviously, but a lot of the there's a more complete like nostalgic experience for like when I think that you're right. It's not just us sounding old, but when you're like physically manipulate things.
Right.
Like a few years
Or
ago,
you're in a space, a particular
yeah,
space.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. A few years ago when I was still like a professor, I was is funny because I was teaching a class, and as you get when you're a young professor, like when I first started, I remember feeling like, oh, I'm pretty cool. Like I can make references that the students will understand. And then as you get older and older, like you start to realize your movie references, like at some point, my references of the Road Warrior, which is like one of my favorite, like, I just like apocalyptic kind of like movies, and but the Mad Max Road Warrior, the second Mad Max movie, from the early '80s was like one of my favorite movies, and I remember at some point, like I would reference it in class, and like it went from like 5 dudes giving me that nod, yeah, man, we know, to like
Right.
nobody,
Yeah.
And then it's funny, but like then like a few years ago, like I was teaching and I was talking about some new like a band and some CD I bought, and everyone started laughing. And I couldn't figure out why they were laughing because I wasn't trying to make a joke. They were laughing that I bought CDs still.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah.
And I was just like, yeah. I mean, and to be honest, I don't. I mean, I do use Spotify. There's definitely. I'm simultaneously a big advocate for like technological advances, and also like somebody who, like you, has strong nostalgia. I like buying physical media, for instance. Like
I feel the same. I
I
was
just
like,
like having it.
yeah. I mean, God, growing up, I mean, I didn't ever have enough money that I wanted to spend on CDs. Like it
Right.
was always a matter of like just choosing one and then listening to it over and over. And if you would have shown me like at that point when I was like 18, like someday you'll have like something in your pocket where you can just look up any song and listen to it, I would just be like, how is that possible? And
Right.
it's only $20 a month. That's crazy.
Right.
And who knows if that model is sustainable for
Right.
for that very reason.
Yeah.
But either way, yeah, it's weird because there's a total market for all that stuff now too. I mean, you see like
Mm-hmm.
the I don't know, like the little Nintendo stuff. I mean, it's
Oh yeah.
everywhere. There feels
Yeah.
like there's toys for Christmas that are meant for dudes our age and people our age.
Yeah.
Be like, you remember when we
Yeah.
played?
There's a term, I don't like it, but maybe you've heard of this, kidulting. Have you heard of this term?
No.
It's a more like it's a yeah,
Kid
it
old
turns
thing.
out
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, it turns out like there's a growing percentage of the toy market is adult, and it's expensive toys. Like it's like stuff that you either a kid would only get because their parents are rich, or or it's for adults because it's like an adult would be the one who would buy like $1,000 Star Wars set or something like that. So like there's this growing market of toys um targeting adults. But in addition to that, like going back to the thing you were saying, we were talking about the CDs. I mean, I that point's a powerful one because I still have my old Nintendo, and I actually have a bunch of old retro video game stuff. I've got PlayStation 5. Like, so it's like I've got the new thing, but I still have the old stuff. And on the surface, I think it can often look like that kind of nostalgia is very materialistic. It's like, well, why do you care about like like why do you care about these video games from your past? It seems like collecting that seems sort of like a consumerist or materialistic kind of endeavor. But at least in my case, and I think what our research suggests too, is like oftentimes like it really isn't about that thing. That thing is like a symbol or an object that can like it serves as like a reminder of like when I was a kid, my parents couldn't afford a Nintendo. My parents were poor, and I remember all the other kids getting Nintendos, and it's like we had this old Atari, and it was like
Hmm.
it was like the graphics were way crappier than I loved the Atari. Like, don't get me wrong, but like as like when I went over to my friend's house and he had this Nintendo, I was like, oh man. Eventually we got the Nintendo, a few years after it already, been out. And at the time I didn't realize what a hardship that was for my, I was just a kid, right? And I didn't
Right.
realize that was like a big financial hardship for my parents. But I cherish that thing, man. Like and so I have all these memories of like playing it with my brother and I staying up all night, like playing video games. And so like, it's not that I want to play like, and it's not like, the graphics don't hold up. It's kind of actually a pain to hook up to modern HDTVs and, all these things, but it's still like really powerful to me. And it's not a material thing. It's like, it brings me back to that time about relationships. And that's really ultimately what we've discovered in nostalgia is most of nostalgia is about relationships. Like it's about like the people in your lives that you really care about, the things you did together that made you who you are. And oftentimes that's wrapped in objects or like music or culture, these kind of cultural and aesthetic experiences. But there's something deeper, deeper than that. It's
Yeah,
not
there's
really
gotta
just about
be.
that stuff, right?
Yeah, I think the easy response to seeing like kid adulting and seeing like a generation of adults that are playing with toys is to be like, oh my God, there's some sort of, there's an arrested development that's happening here. This is some sort of like um retrograde I don't know. It's a kind of like a self-care of
Yeah, yeah,
but the other part of it to me is wondering, well, what's it really about? Because
yeah, right.
it's not just about kind of like, oh, I love Nintendo.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
the fact that it's such a common phenomenon across cultures, the kind of like embracing of those objects, it means that I don't know. In a lot of ways, it's almost like developing a religion of self or a cult of self in some ways. If that makes sense,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
sort of like,
yeah,
oh, I have all this iconography. These things are me. I mean, you see
yeah,
the posters behind me. I have like movie posters on the wall. Like,
yeah.
why are there movie posters on the wall? Why are those things there? They're like they remind you of like who you
Mhm.
are.
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
I don't know. It seems
And
like
yeah.
I
And
wonder.
music is
Yeah,
like
go
the
ahead.
soundtrack to our lives, right? Like, I mean, yeah,
Oh,
all
music
these.
is I think one of the most powerful
Oh,
delivery
yeah.
systems for this for sure.
Yeah. No, I totally agree with that. And the way going back to I'm not trying to, this isn't like a plug for Nintendo, but going
So
back
much
to like,
Nintendo. But
right?
it's dude, Mario is just reigns supreme over
I know this is
decades, honestly.
so Nintendo's genius is so like if sometimes you see nostalgia used in a very, very like dumb, like kind of just cash grab way of like, oh, we're just going to repackage something. Nostalgia is at its best when a creator or creators can figure out like how to tap into that thing for us, for our generation, but in a way that younger, like we can pass on, and it's relevant to the that we pass on to our kids, and so they won't just be like, oh, that's some loser thing my dad's into. They'll find their own version of it, but then there's like a there's a way for us to a common language, a common language that we can talk about things, because and Nintendo does this really well because they always innovate, like they always do like
Mm.
some kind of new thing that and not just, they don't just like make the graphics better, like they come up with some clever new way. I don't remember how big the Nintendo Wii was, like with the motion controls and all that stuff, but
Hmm.
they always come up with some kind of clever way to make something feel fresh, even though like their top like characters, their top games like Mario, Zelda, Pokemon, stuff like that is all like nostalgia.
Yeah.
And so like some people are really, really uh, good at that. Like some creators are just really, artists, and like are really, really good at doing that, like figuring out like the right amount of nostalgia that honors because that's another thing, you can really piss off hardcore fans like if you do nostalgia wrong, right? Like if you
Right, of course.
again, like the
Because
religion
you're
thing, like if
playing with religious
right,
material.
if
Yep.
you violate something that's, if you violate, like you have to be, a lot of times I think people wrongly think nostalgia is an easy go-to for like making money, like, oh, like we can just make something and like pull on nostalgia. It's like, actually I think it's nostalgia can be very, very successful, um but it's harder to pull off, I think, because you got to simultaneously, it's harder to do successfully because you've got to simultaneously like not offend the old the old
Yeah.
fans, the original people, while bringing in a new generation and connecting them over something. And I don't think that's easy to do. I think if you do it right, it is a good investment. I think that's definitely true, but the assumption that you could just do it and people are gonna um people are going to just fall for it, it's like a lot of stuff ends up sort of bombing because it is like they don't do it right, if that makes sense.
Right. I'm thinking about the Disney
Hmm.
Corporation as just one of the most powerful nostalgia machines for
Right.
decades now. And it's the same. I mean, Mickey Mouse has been an icon for so many years, and The other day, I was the cashier at Trader Joe's had a Mickey Mouse sweatshirt on, but it was like the old school, like 1940s Mickey Mouse, and I
Mm.
commented on it. I was like, "Oh, that's the classic Mickey," and he was like, "Yeah, I don't like the new Mickey. They like ruined him, you know, like he's like not as cool as the old Mickey." And I'm like, "Yeah, there's something I don't know. There's it's weird there's some power hip cachet to the old stuff,
Yeah.
as well. I don't know. I'm thinking about like the cultural narrative and then how nostalgia is because we've talked about this a lot on the show over the years, how
Mhm.
nostalgia intersects with like national narratives and politics
Mm.
because it
Yeah.
seems like
Yeah.
politicians engage
Yeah.
nostalgia. I mean, make America great again
Right.
is a nostalgic slogan, right,
Right.
and it's not even a new one. It's one that seems like it's actually well chosen in part
Hmm.
because it's like that you can activate that so easily
Right.
in sort of like national projects. I think it feels like that's part of nostalgia's power too, right? Is sort of like
Yeah.
its
Yeah.
ability
No,
to
that's definitely true.
organize societies. Yeah,
Yeah. And there is and there obviously can be, you can think about that in positive and negative ways. I mean, one of the things I try to do in my book is point out that if you find yourself being nostalgic in a way where you're seduced by this narrative that everything was better in the past,
right.
then you need to take a step. You need to ask yourself a series of questions because I think it doesn't actually take long to disabuse somebody of that. Because if you ask them like, "What would you like to give up?" I mean, we've all either ourselves or have family. It doesn't take very long to find a family member or friend, or if not ourselves, whose lives, um, who are alive today because of advances in medicine, for instance, or something
Right,
like that, right?
right.
And so, not to mention like like social advances. And I mean, if you asked minority groups if life was better, 50 years ago, many of them are probably going to say, no. So it's like you have to get more surgical. You have to encourage people to be more surgical. It's like, well, when you think that we need to make America great again, which, like you said, I think actually maybe you know more about this than I do. But I think maybe it was Reagan
Yeah.
who said it, and then it was Clinton, and then, like you said, like this has been a political catchphrase that's been repeated multiple times.
It seems like it must be popular. Like it must be a
Yeah,
popular notion in
right.
America, whether you're like lean liberal or lean right.
Yeah,
You're sort of like, yeah, it was better at another
yeah,
time. Whatever you
yeah,
could just choose which
yeah,
time it might be, but it seems like you could just do a poll, like how many people would say the country's gone to hell in the last 10
yeah,
years,
yeah.
and then
And it's hot, like
yeah,
yeah. And so, in fact, I mean, that's one of the um you know, I've got this, I wouldn't say like a debate, but I've got I've had these interactions with people in, what I would call sort of the Silicon Valley, like progress space. And to be clear, like like I mentioned before, like I like technological progress. I like that you and I can have this conversation,
totally.
and be thousands of miles apart. And I mean, in a lot of ways, like the Spotify example, in a lot of ways that broadened things, like when I was a kid, I lived in a small town, and like I had to watch whatever movies. Like I'd walk down to this video store, and like it was pretty limited. And to think that at my fingertips, like now we have all this international cinema. I was always trying to get the video store to be like, hey, could you like order some Japanese movies, or,
Right, right.
what I mean? So like just in terms of breadth of, access to things, it's so much better. Now I think you can make a reasonable argument that like how, like we've sacrificed depth for breadth. Like we're not going as deeply for the reasons you talked about, like of like really interacting with
Why are
some,
people collecting vinyl right now, right?
right,
Because it's
right,
like it's when I used to care about music. Like I look at Spotify, I'm like, who gives a fuck about all this? Like
right.
it's just like millions of songs. It cheapened it. I don't know.
Yeah, no, no. So yeah, so it's like that, it's like you have more, but you can't really like really appreciate something deeply. But so, when people do that, and obviously politicians do that in a kind of I don't want to sound cynical, but in sort of a manipulative way, you know what I mean? Like, oh, like
Sure.
this is like a campaign effort. But I think like if you actually push people a little bit, like to be like, okay, what do you actually think was better, and get more surgical and get more precise. Um, I think that can be helpful because then a lot of times what you have, regardless of people's politics, a lot of times, you'll hear something about like, well, families used to sit down and have dinner, or my family used to have dinner together, or there's something that's kind of intimate, and they feel like that's missing. And what they're saying, or they're not saying this explicitly, but like in a sense, I think what they're communicating and what they're feeling is there's some wisdom from the, like, I don't want to return to the past, but there's some wisdom or lessons from the past that I think could actually help us improve the present. And I think social media, like on the space of technology, like that's a good example. Like we did a poll last year, or maybe no, it was earlier this spring actually. We did a national poll asking Americans of all age, adults of all ages, but including young adults, which we were really interested in, about their thoughts on like emerging technology, like artificial intelligence and these different things. And not surprisingly, Americans are pretty curious, and they like new stuff, like shiny new things, and they're interested about this stuff. But even young people expressed like a longing for a time before everyone was hyper connected, and that was interesting for the youngest group because, like you noted before, like these are people that grew up with smartphones. They grew up on the internet, like the Gen Z cohort, but they also have a nostalgia for a time before that, and they're not saying I want to get rid of technology. They very much like their technology. What they're saying is there's something I feel like I'm missing by having by having so much of my social life mediated by these devices that are so powerful and so distracting, and like don't always bring out the best in us. And so it's like I don't think they want to go back to when I don't think they want to live the way I lived in the 80s, but they think there might be some lesson there for like building for moving forward.
That seems like the essence of what you're saying about nostalgia in part is that it's like, life was harder, but you also know that it was richer in some way, right? And that to me, that I mean, we've read accounts of people that survived the Holocaust that hold a sort of nostalgia for that period of being in the camps, and that to me is mind-blowing, right? It's like just like the totally opposite idea of what you would ever think. It's not like they're thinking, oh, I want to go back to the Holocaust. It's more like this is where meaning was created in our lives, and it's something that we hold on to forever, and that's just the way it is. It's just the way our lives played out. God, it makes so much sense, dude, when you're thinking about like the sort of activation of nostalgia as an ideology in the culture and in politics, that it would be associated with family and like wanting to go back to family because you're like, you mentioned like, we all used to eat dinner together. I mean, isn't that like it seems like it's a total projection of your own sort of like insecurity and feeling like what is missing, and then projecting that onto the whole society of like, my mom used to love me,
My mom used to love
that
me.
sort of thing. And it's, I mean, I'm joking, but I mean, it really does feel like nostalgia is love in some way. That there's sort of like, I'm nostalgic for when love was in my life in a powerful way.
You actually hit it on the head because in a lot of our research, the common theme, and we've looked at all sorts of different facets of nostalgia, but the common theme is that like that sense of like secure attachment, like this is like who actually cares about me the most, and what we know from other research, not related to nostalgia directly, is like when people feel that sense of like security, like when they feel that sense of like I have people, family, friends, loved one, romantic partners, all sorts of relationships. When I feel deeply connected to people that have my back, you're more bold. You're more willing to take risks. You're more open-minded. You're more willing to just put yourself out there because you feel that sense of security. It's when you feel like really anxious and like no one's got, like you can't trust anyone and no one's got your back, that you withdraw, that you become more suspicious. And so sort of the irony, I think, of certain like types of like, I think there are kind of dark sides of political nostalgia for sure, especially the kind that anytime in nostalgia is like, oh, life used to be better when we didn't let these people in, or we, like any type of like nostalgia that's focused on, I think it's a good red flag for people, a warning sign for people to be like, if my nostalgia involves seeing other groups in a bad way, that's probably not real. That's probably not real helpful. It would be better, again, to get more surgical and think about, well, um, what is it about group life that I really want? Like what, what I, and what people really want is they want to like that communal sense of they're part of something, that people, that they have relationships, that people care about them. They're part of something, going back to the existential nature of that I started talking about, like that they're part of something transcendent, something bigger than themselves. And, ideally we want to channel that into like positive, constructive directions. Cause we all, like you said, we all want to feel love. We all want to feel connected. And we want to avoid it going down like a dark path, obviously, that involves like leading to prejudice and discrimination and things like that. And luckily, I think most of the time that's not what nostalgia is. I mean, I certainly think people have weaponized it and can use it in those ways. But like even in some of the studies that people have done looking at like nostalgia for groups, oftentimes what they find is nostalgia increases, like nostalgia for your college days, for instance, increases your like sense of like in group like connection, like you feel like you're part of that group, but it doesn't necessarily like make you dislike other groups. It just makes you feel like a stronger connection. And so I think that's a healthier form of nostalgia than something that's built around this added dimension of, but we have to like not like this other group or something.
Right. I mean, I've spent most of my time as an academic in the history discipline and thinking about American history specifically, and so much of it is sort of not necessarily constructed as nostalgia, but it's if there is a political use or a social or cultural use of history, it's sort of like exactly what you're talking about, which is sort of looking to the past to like what worked. What how did other people overcome adversity and what did they do, and what, how does that apply to our present situation? I wondered if you could talk a little bit about loneliness, because we tapped on it a little bit, but I know it's a part of what your book is about, is sort of thinking about loneliness, because you mentioned, like, I don't know, the kind of group experience as a common nostalgic thing. And during the pandemic, I would describe myself often as kind of like a misanthrope in a lot of ways. It's sort of like a person that's sort of like outside of society. But I think the misanthrope is also the person that like really loves everybody else in a lot of ways. It's sort of like, I don't know, there's a push and pull there. But either way, during the pandemic, I was really feeling like, God, I wish I were part of a team. Like, I wish I were part of a group somewhere that's doing something together. And it seems like that's a common nostalgic point for people, is like, remember when we worked together on something. And I don't know, that seems like a key part of what you're talking about too when you're talking about loneliness.
I mean, so at our core, we're a social species. Like we like being around other people. we need other, at the bare minimum, we need at least one other person to if we want to reproduce. Want to keep the species going, we need
so
to
far
right. So basic, so far, right, at some basic level. But we have a bias towards relationships. Social pain is one of the most severe forms of psychological harm. I remember years ago going to this talk by a researcher who studied was an expert in ostracism, and he was doing these experiments where he was like these really, really, like, they seemed like trivial examples of ostracism, where it was called, the paradigm was called cyberball. And you're playing a game on the computer and you think you're playing with two other people. It's actually just a program to make you think you're playing with two other people. And you're doing this virtual ball tossing game. So you and I are tossing the ball, and there's another person on here we're tossing it to. At some point in the game, if you're assigned to the ostracism condition, you stop getting the ball tossed to you. Now, keep in mind, you don't know these people. These aren't like friends or anything, but it stings. And what's great about this paradigm is he was able to, through like webcams, like he was able to like record their actual like musculature, their sort of immediate response, like automatic response to this, and it hurts. Like, it hurts to be ostracized, even by strangers. And he actually got the idea from a life story. Like, he said he was at the park one time with this dog, and these two dudes are throwing a frisbee, and they threw the frisbee and it like went over, it landed by him accidentally, like he wasn't part of the frisbee game, and he picked up and threw it back, and then they just sort of organically incorporated him into this thing, and so the three of them are throwing this frisbee, and he's like, at some point they just quit throwing it to him. And he's like, I didn't go there with them, I didn't know them, but he's like, it hurt my feelings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so
So
what's
like
that?
I think that's just an example of, yeah, this, like at some fundamental level we want to belong, and
Yeah.
it's just wired in us.
Well, I feel like there's like FOMO, the feeling of missing out, as you know,
Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah,
common sort of meme online. But the idea of, yeah, exactly that, seemingly like project. I mean, to me, like I'm the type of person that would project so much into that little interaction, even if
right,
it's just a bot not playing the not throwing the ball to me. I'm like
yeah,
projecting, well, this ball hates me. I must
yeah,
have done something to offend the ball in some
right,
way,
right,
and you begin
yeah,
hating yourself essentially. Yeah, that is powerful.
yeah.
You
So
feel
what
it. Yeah.
nostalgia, yeah, so what nostalgia does in that situation is, we when we have experiences like that where we feel ostracized, excluded, lonely, we tend to bring to mind nostalgic memories of socially fulfilling experiences, and that does two things. One, it takes us out of the moment and it reminds us, it's going back to our talk about time. It reminds us that this is just a moment. It's really, really unpleasant, but it's not my whole life. It's just a moment. And so that gives you some hope that, well, it won't last forever. But for it not to last forever, you kind of need to do something about the loneliness. And one of the cool features of nostalgia is it doesn't just like make you feel comforted of like being like, oh yeah, I used to have friends. It actually gives you some confidence that's like, oh, I could do that again, and it makes you want to it makes you want to reconnect with people, or it even gives you kind of the courage to go out and make new connections, because when you have that sense of like, oh, I've done this before, that serves as a reminder that you could probably do it again. And
Mm,
I think that
yeah.
that was one of the threads of evidence that really got me thinking about this idea of past forward. There's like, nostalgia doesn't just comfort, it also kind of is a push, right? It's something that like pushes us towards people. And there's also interesting research. I didn't do this research, but some scholars in the UK and in China did some work on like nostalgia, like making people more generous and more pro-social. Like people gave
Mm,
more money to charities when they felt nostalgic.
mm.
So there's just this notion that nostalgia like brings the pro-social side of you online. Like it makes you want to help people. It makes you want to like talk to people. It makes you more empathetic towards people. And also there was a recent study I saw that's pretty cool, that's showing that actually nostalgia makes people more likely to ask for help too. So it doesn't just make you helpful, it makes you like more willing to ask others. So in a
Wow.
lot of ways, I think nostalgia just sort of activates or like turns up the knob of sociality in us. Um,
Yeah.
and it makes us like, it pushes us towards each other, which I thought was kind of cool and counterintuitive, because oftentimes people think of nostalgia as this very introspective, um,
Mm-hmm.
almost like antisocial experiences, like, oh, you're just sitting around by yourself, like, watching old reruns of old shows or something like that. It's like, I guess you could do that, but a lot of times what it does, it sort of like pushes you to like want to connect with other people and share those memories and talk about those things.
I love that. And I love the idea that nostalgia isn't just an autobiographical sort of hobby,
Yeah,
but is instead, I don't know. I think in my best moments, I would think of it that way. It's like, so nostalgia is sort of a way of remembering who you are, and like your
yeah,
core values, and like
right,
they're just sort of like packed in reminders of remember that memory and what it
yeah,
means. Um,
yeah,
Play Rutledge. This was really fun. I want to thank
yeah.
you for coming out. I think it's very refreshing after thinking about nostalgia for so many years as just a machine that can be used very cynically.
Hmm.
At the same point, at the same token, I guess I think interested in nostalgia because it is such a powerful device in
Yeah.
my own life, and one that I'm constantly sort of interrogating why I'm lost in the past. And as we approach the like Christmas season, the most nostalgic
Yeah,
period of the year, it's weird because I have like horrible memories associated with Christmas, honestly, and yet
yeah,
I feel the kind of vibe that
Yeah.
I'm sitting down watching Die Hard last night because it's a tradition. We
It's
all
like
have
the
our
best
rituals.
Christmas movie.
Totally is. But I want to say the name of your book before we go.
Yeah.
Again, it's called Past Forward: How Nostalgia Can Help You Live a More Meaningful Life. And I just found a lot of the ideas just so much fun. And I thank you for coming on and talking about your stuff with me, Clay.
Thanks so much, Dave, for having me on. It was a lot of fun, and especially fun to talk to a fellow nostalgic, because I obviously get the vibe from you that you're very nostalgic, and we're similar ages, so I think we can probably have similar connection points with the cultural references.
Oh
So
yeah.
yeah, I appreciate it, and Die Hard's definitely on my. I'll wait till a little bit closer to Christmas. It'll probably be like the main event for me.
So I like to telling everyone, stay tuned for our follow-up episode just on Nintendo.
Yeah, we
Um,
could do a Die Hard and a Nintendo and
Isn't that
a
funny though? It's exactly what we're talking about because I rejoice when I meet dudes my age now. I see a little gray in the beard and I'm like, "Oh,
yeah.
this guy remembers."
He's gonna
Like
know.
right. And you know what
Yeah,
it's again that kind of like team thing of like, "Oh, we're all kind of together in something. We're not alone in
yeah,
remembering Nintendo that way."
yeah. No, I think so, and I think that is largely a good thing because it's like, it's hard to as you get our age too. Like it's kind of hard to make friends. It's kind of hard to like connect with people, and so it is sort of nice to be like, we have a we have this connection point. Like
Yeah.
we have these references that we share, and even when you have you were mentioning the negative memories about Christmas. Which a lot of people do have. Negative experiences and
Sure.
holidays and kind of in the sort of affective depressive sort of stuff that comes along with that. It's like one of the like silver linings I think is when people do have nostalgia, like you were talking about. Like I think what our brain is saying is like, it doesn't, like, yeah, like we've had these bad memories, we've had these bad experiences, but there are other possibilities. Like it doesn't, like it's like, what in your minds, like what you think Christmas should be. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
oftentimes we do that as a way to be like, well, I'm going to make things better for the memories I'm creating now. And so one of the things that I think is really cool, and I think maybe you mentioned, I was listening to your previous episode on the was it Stand By Me? What's the
Yeah.
movie called?
Yeah. Stand by me. Yep.
Yeah, I was listening to that, which was really good, by the way.
Oh, thank
I
you.
haven't seen that movie for decades. Now I kind of want to go rewatch
Total
it.
nostalgia fest, that one.
Right, right. But I think you mentioned something about like nostalgia happens or you said something alluding to like nostalgia kind of happens in the present too. It's like
Mhm.
we know right now, like we're making, like we're having experiences that are going to be like the fuel for nostalgia in the future.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what happens a lot of times when we look back about something, even if we have an unpleasant memory. It's like we want it to be better. We want it to, and we want to be like, well, I can make new memories. And so when I'm looking back on it, like I've rehabilitated Christmas
Right. Yeah. And
in
that
a
the good
way.
old days are yet to come, right?
Yeah,
Like they're
yeah,
not just in the past, they're the future too. Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, that's the way you have to look at it, honestly. Like
yeah, yeah.
otherwise you're just
Depressed.
completely lost. Yeah, but it totally makes me, over the years, especially living in Brooklyn, I used to constantly, and I still see it here, like coffee shops, donut shops, like people, like old men sitting around drinking coffee in the
Yeah,
mornings, like just bullshitting with each other. And I was always
yeah,
like, what are they talking about? And it's like now my dad is that age. He's 80.
yeah.
He has a group of
Okay.
guys that he sits and talks, and they just talk about
Yeah,
the old times, and it's not a grim thing at all.
yeah,
Honestly, it
yeah,
seems like they are cataloging who they are
yeah,
and what life means
yeah,
when they do that. Yeah. God, you've got
yeah.
such a cool vision of nostalgia. I'm gonna take it with me. Thank you.
Thanks, man. I
Yeah.
appreciate it.
We'll talk to you
Thanks for
soon.
having me on. Yep. Bye.
Bye. Well, all right, my friends, I think that's going to do it for today's Nostalgia Trap. I want to thank my guest, Clay Routledge, for offering a whole new set of angles for considering what nostalgia is and what it does or doesn't do for us. I really enjoyed that, and I hope you did too. Go check out all of our bonus material, including our latest Justin Rogers Cooper yearly wrap-up of 2023. Very excited to present all that stuff. The Patreon link is in the episode description. I hope all is going well for you. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.